Tēnā koutou katoa. Tuarua, ki ngā mate, haere, 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 atu rā. E mihi, ana te mana whenua, o nai toa, o Ngāti Toa me Taranaki whānui. Kia tātou e taunei, kia ora. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So it gives me a lot of pleasure tonight to welcome Max Rashbrooke back for the Fabians. Max is a research fellow at the School of Government at Victoria University. Tonight we're not going to talk about, we're saving the election results and the anatomy of the election for our next session. But tonight it's a different form of democracy that we're going to look at. So I'll hand over to Max to explain citizens' assemblies. Thanks, Max.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks for that introduction, Philip. Lovely to see a good number of people here. Yes, so I'm going to be talking to you about citizens' assemblies in general and very specifically the Wellington City Council Citizens' Assembly, an exciting democratic innovation that took place in this very room over 4 weekends in September and October. Just want to acknowledge that we've got a great range of people in the room, including some members of the assemblies, and city councillors, city council staff, deliberative experts, some former politicians, and so I'm sure there'll be some great questions afterwards, and as a deliberative Democrat I'm committed to leaving lots of time for those questions. So I'll talk a bit about the Wellington City Council Citizens' Assembly specifically in a moment, but what I first want to do is just set this innovation in the wider context of the world and the democracy that we're working in. And the background to that, of course, is yet another crisis of democracy. I think that trend can be overstated because democracy is always in crisis. John Dewey, for instance, wrote that democracy today is under a cloud, and he wrote that in 1923. In the 1970s, you have New York Times writers going to Europe and saying, well, it is obvious to anyone travelling in Europe today that democracy is completely unable to deal with the challenges of the modern world, and its leaders are, its decisions are outpaced by technology, and its leaders are incapable of, serving the collective will. So these problems are eternal. I think it's the natural state of democracy up to a point. On the other hand, there are some very real problems, which I think we in this room probably all know about, so I won't sort of labour them, but, globally we see declining trust in all kinds of institutions, including democratic ones. In New Zealand, that trust is holding up a little better than it is in other places, but on a lot of measures, you still only get about half of the population saying they really trust the New Zealand government to make decisions that are in everyone's interests. And there's all kinds of threats from misinformation and disinformation and the rising appeal in some countries of autocracy. And just a generalised sense that we have these democratic institutions, parliaments, and these processes and consultations, and are they really fit for the 21st century? Are they the set of sort of rules and processes and bodies that we would design now if we were starting from scratch? And generally most people's sense is no, they are not. Okay, so we face a big question about how do we reinvigorate democracy? How is it going to maintain its hold on people's affections? And, one way of doing that is going back and looking at history, and in this case I particularly mean the history of Western democratic thought. And, sometimes when people give this talk, it's like, Athens, and they get very excited about that. And that's fair up to a point, ancient Athens. But actually, if you look at sort of the full democratic record, there are assemblies in the Middle East, in way back in the before Common Era period, assemblies that were gathered together of ordinary people, which kind of spoke to power, had some kind of sway or influence over decision makers. That then spread sort of east into India and west into Athens, where, yes, at least if you were a, free resident male, You got to come together in these big assemblies in this place called the Pnyx in ancient Athens, and a lot of you collectively took decisions together, and a lot of the positions, the bureaucratic structure, if you like, or the decision-making positions were allocated not based on elections, but based on what's called sortition, so lotteries. Basically, your name got plucked out of a hat. Then in the West, in Europe and in America, you have the creation of representative democracy, so electing other people to make decisions for us, which was a reasonable response to the challenges of the time and the difficulties of gathering everyone together in large, complex societies with sort of minimal telecommunications infrastructure. And then in the 20th century, we have what the scholar John Keane calls monitory democracy, which is you still got representative democracy, representatives doing their things, but they're not just left alone to do that. There's this whole apparatus of monitoring bodies that get built up around them. So the media and the courts and watchdog bodies and NGOs and things like that. And that's loosely what we've inherited. I mean, this is all very broad brush, obviously, but that's loosely what we've inherited in the West in the 21st century. And so the question arises, well, what next? And one of the things that I think represents a path forward, a way of doing democracy differently, a way of reinvigorating it and sort of warding off the appeal of authoritarianism, is something called everyday democracy. And that's kind of based on a viewpoint about wanting to go beyond elections. And, some of the intuitions here go back to, say, the American founding fathers, who sort of made the point that, you can have people coming along to vote once every few years, but what about all the other days of the year? How are they made to feel a participant in government, not just one day every 3 years, but on all the other days? And that's a kind of a form of democracy, it's everyday democracy, which is based on a couple of things. One of them is participation. So the idea that we should be active participants in government, way beyond just voting. We should be, as citizens, as much as possible, getting in there, taking part in decision making. So profoundly influencing the big political decisions that shape our lives, the decisions that are taken by local councils and central government, to the greatest extent possible, or maybe even taking those decisions ourselves. But everyday democracy, as the term is normally used, also really emphasises the importance of deliberation. Well, participation is a term that I'm sure will be familiar to all of you, deliberation less so, but crudely speaking, it means high quality public discussion. And so this is the idea that if democracy is going to work well, it's not really just about saying, well, we've got the numbers, we got more votes than someone else. It's about saying, well, these decisions have to be justified by the giving of reasons and the exchange of reasons. They can take decisions, but before they take decisions, they actually have to argue the toss with each other. So they have to engage with evidence and with experts. They have to give reasons for their position. They have to listen, and they have to be willing to be able to shift their own positions based on stronger evidence and better arguments. And so I sometimes summarize the importance of these two things by saying that participation empowers the crowd, but deliberation makes it wise. Every one of us in this room, if I put up some kind of big, policy problem, some issue that Wellington is facing, each of us would have a part of the answer in our own minds. But unless we discuss it together, unless we bring that wisdom to the surface, then we aren't really wise as a crowd, because that little bit of the puzzle just remains held within each of us and isn't brought out, isn't added into the collective view. So participation and deliberation are both really important. And so then you get what I think are the advantages of everyday democracy. Obviously, it involves active citizenship. So it's drawing on people's capacity to be really deeply engaged in democratic processes beyond just voting. To the extent, of course, that that's realistic, given the other demands on people's lives, and I'll come back to that at the end. There's good evidence that when you involve people more deeply in decision-making in this way, you enhance their trust in the political process and in politicians and the decisions that are taken. Those decisions are seen to be more legitimate because they more deeply reflect citizens' actual preferences. You also just get better quality decisions, frankly speaking, thanks in part to the fact that everyone is an expert in their own life. So everyone has really important information about how public services need to work and what services they and their communities need. And so you also just get enhanced confidence in the idea that government might work and that it might be effective. And I think that's really important in the current political moment, where I think we've just had a government voted out of power, certainly not entirely because people disagreed substantively with their direction of travel, because contrary maybe to some other people in this room, I'm not convinced that the new government, whatever form it takes, will actually have a massively different direction of travel. What I think a lot of the vote was based on just people feeling like promises weren't being delivered upon. I think this was very much a competence-based election that we've just seen, and part of the result of it being just a profound view that government just isn't working the way it should. It's just not delivering. So these kinds of things are really important, even if you don't sort of really care about them philosophically, or you don't buy sort of some of the theoretical advantages of participation and deliberation. I mean, if you want government that does stuff, people are going to have to believe that it works. And I think these sorts of methods are really important for making government work better. So what does this actually look like in practice? I mean, this is all very high level, right? Participation, deliberation. What does it look like in practice? Well, one of the things it doesn't look like in practice is referenda, or not particularly, because obviously referenda are extremely participatory if they're binding, but they're not particularly deliberative. There's no guarantee that anyone voting in a referendum has thought hard about the issue. I mean, there's actually no guarantee they even understand the question, and I think a fair amount of the Brexit vote would suggest that really people certainly didn't understand the implications of it. And there's no evidence that they would have talked about the issue or been forced to confront alternative viewpoints, but particularly forced to confront viewpoints they wouldn't normally encounter in their day-to-day life. So, I mean, I'm not totally against referenda. I think they've got their place, but this isn't really what this is about. It's much more about forums where you get both participation and deliberation. One example of that is participatory budgeting, where classically a local body puts up a proportion of its public works budget for the community to allocate directly after they've discussed it all deeply amongst themselves. And that's something that Wellington City Council has also promised it's going to do sort of further down the track as part of the process that the Citizens' Assembly was part of. And yes, and obviously Citizens' Assemblies themselves are, one particularly striking example of everyday democracy. I have to underline they're not a silver bullet. Some people do get a little bit fixated on them. They're just one model amongst many, as sort of what I'll talk about as a kind of ecosystem of democratic practices that we might seek to foster, but they are increasingly popular. There was a big report out from the OECD recently called Catching the Deliberative Wave, which listed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of citizens' assemblies that have sprung up, most of them in the last 5 to 10 years. The famous examples include a couple in Ireland on marriage equality and abortion reform, which did ultimately go to referenda to get sort of validated. But the citizens' assemblies and the conclusions there that there needed to be really significant reform on those two issues was hugely influential. There's also been citizens' assemblies that have drawn up mental health action plans in Canada. Recently, there was the French ran a Convention citoyenne sur le climat, sort of Citizens Climate Assembly, effectively, where 150 ordinary French people were given 9 months in the task of drawing up a plan for France to meet its 2030 carbon emissions commitments, which they came up with some pretty amazing recommendations, a number of which were then knocked back by the politicians, which is quite a familiar feature in this story. But I interviewed a member of the French Climate Assembly last year, and he said, well, look, actually, we still got quite a few of our proposals through, and our proposals are still very much there in the discussion because they have this incredible legitimacy. Because you can point to them and they say, and say this is what 150 representative French people wanted to happen. So even when these things, these citizens' assemblies, aren't immediately influential, they can have a long-term form of influence. It's really important. And so what these things are, these citizens' assemblies, is they're a form of what people would call a mini-public. So they're a representative sample of the population. So they have, so they will be gender balanced, for instance, and they will have as many under 25s and as many over 65s as there are in proportion to how many there are in the wider population. So they're brought together and they're asked to think about and make recommendations on a topic of key public importance. And their recommendations, at the very least, are sort of a very advanced form of consultation. They show sort of politicians, decision makers, what the public really wants, or they can very strongly influence the decisions that politicians make, or in some cases they can sort of have a mandate to actually take the decision themselves. So that's the participation bit, but they're also structured so that the people in this assembly, this mini public, can discuss the issue deeply with each other. And so they're given time, they're trained in how to discuss issues well with each other, they're put in front of evidence and experts, and they're given a lot of time to discuss things, to thrash things out. And so that's the deliberation part of it. And at the end of all that, they come up with recommendations that the whole group can at least agree to live with. So like I said, so the advantage of the Citizens' Assembly is it gives you, it allows you to say, well, this is actually what the public wants. Once it's talked about the issue, once it's thrashed it out, once people have listened to each other and shifted their opinion. That's particularly valuable when there are really complex trade-offs to be made. And most political issues, it's quite rare that there's a single scientifically correct answer. Very often, even quite technical stuff like tax policy is fundamentally a matter of moral trade-offs, who should pay what. So citizens' assemblies are really valuable for demonstrating how the public wants those trade-offs to be handled. They're very useful on issues where conventional politics has reached deadlock, or where sort of sharply drawn partisan lines just get horrendously in the way of any kind of sensible discussion. They're also useful for issues where the public debate has got very heated, or politicians know that they want to do something, but they don't have the kind of the political sort of allowance, they don't have kind of the political mandate to do it. And the comparison between citizens' assemblies and conventional government consultations is very telling, and I think helps draw out the advantages of things like citizens' assemblies. I mean, obviously they're different from consultation in the sense that if they have some degree of influence or devolved decision-making power, then they're much more participatory than just being asked, what do you think about, this option for a cycleway or something? But they're also obviously much more deliberative. I mean, for me, one of the great weaknesses of the conventional consultations that government departments are forever asking us to do is not just that very often it feels quite meaningless, but that you're just asking people in isolation to write down their views on something as if everybody has preformed views, and the only task of democracy is just to elicit them. But in point of fact, often we don't actually know what we think until we've discussed it with other people. Well, certainly we can't claim to have an informed opinion unless we've discussed it with other people. So the problem with classic consultation is it is just you by yourself just typing your views into the text box. So the Citizens' Assembly, by contrast, not just much more participatory, but much more deliberative. The New Zealand experience with sort of, the classic sort of Western concept of the Citizens' Assembly is pretty minimal. There have been some experiences with citizens' juries in the past, including in Wellington. Some people may remember the one on capital power back in the 90s. More recently, though, Watercare last year ran what might be considered, the first sort of full-scale Citizens' Assembly in New Zealand, where they got a bunch of Aucklanders to come together and answer the question, what should be Auckland's next major water source for 2040, I think it was. And they deliberated over a number of weekends and basically came up with the answer that probably should be recycled water. as the most sustainable, viable future source, rather than just taking more water out of the Waikato River all the time. There's also some work being led by Ngāti Toa and a group called the People Speak in Porirua, which is a very, very impressive, very deep work, where, as I understand it, I mean, I'm sort of not fully across this, but as I understand it, they basically have created a standing assembly of community leaders. So that's not a citizens' assembly, but it's a community forum, which is calling a talanoa, to come together to discuss issues in the area, which will then commission citizens' assemblies on specific topics. And those citizens' assemblies are going to work on a fully te tiriti, whether they're calling wānanga, which will work on a fully sort of te tiriti-centric basis. So in the outline I've seen, there will sort of be a group of, there will be a kind of tēnā rangatiratanga, wānanga, there will be a kāwanatanga, sort of, Pākehā Crown sort of wānanga, and there will be a relational wānanga to work out the interfaces between the other two, which sounds like an incredible model. It's obviously immense amount of work, and it's taking a fair bit of time to stand up, but their hope is to get going on that next year. I understand it. And then we have the Wellington City Council Citizens Assembly as the most recent experiment, and that's what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about. So the Wellington City Council Citizens Assembly was convened to make recommendations on the long-term plan, which is sort of the council's 10-year vision of what it's going to do, what its sort of outline direction is for the city. The council sent out 10,000 invites to Wellingtonians, asking people if they wanted to take part in this Citizens Assembly. They received 800 positive responses, which mightn't seem like a lot, but they were only expecting 400, a 4% response rate, which is about what you get for those things that pop up on the website saying, will you fill out the survey about the website? So getting twice the response for that, for something which required people to give up 4 Saturdays, is pretty good. Yeah, so 800 positive responses, including, ironically, mine, which I just put in to show support for the process, and I was quite recently weeded out in the selection process, all of which was done by an independent company, incidentally, so that no one could say, oh, well, the council has handpicked the citizens it wanted. Yes, there was one independent observer of the process throughout the whole process, me. And I should stress on that what I'm going to give you now are only my views. The council is going to be publishing its full report on the process, which I understand is imminent. I mean, I was there for all bar 2 hours of the assembly, but having said that, I mean, I could only observe what one person could observe. There's lots of stuff behind the scenes that I won't observe, so these are only partial reflections. But anyway, the Citizens Assembly was 43 Wellingtonians, selected by an independent firm based on 6 characteristics: age, gender, ethnicity, home ownership status, so a mix of homeowners and renters, education as a proxy for income, and location within the city. And so when they were all gathered literally here in this room, it really was very powerful, because it's so incredibly rare that you actually see a representative group of people. I mean, for any kind of democratic process, normally a lot of them just look like me. So a very, very representative group of Wellingtonians, broadly equal gender split, 16% of the assembly at whakapapa Māori, 12% from Pacifica backgrounds. Because the council is committed to votes at 16, 2 members of the assembly were aged between 16 and 18, and you also had really good numbers of people aged between 18 and 34, who of course classically also typically don't take part, or to a much lesser extent in democratic processes. So you start to see, one of the advantages of these things is that they really engage people who wouldn't otherwise be engaged in the process. And they really were Wellington in a room, basically. And yes, so they gave up 4 of their Saturdays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m, right here, in the presence of 2 facilitators, one Pākehā, one Māori. I mean, unlike what the Ngāti Toa are working on in Porirua, well, you wouldn't say it was a footy treaty, te tiriti-centric process, but certainly tikanga were prominent throughout. And the question that the Assembly was given was, we need to find a balance between what the Wellington City Council could deliver, in brackets do, and what resources it has available, which is fair to everyone. How could we do this? And so this is with reference to the long-term plan. So quite a big question, quite a broad question. The end point was for the Assembly to produce some recommendations on the long-term plan which addressed this question. So bringing to bear that expertise in their own lives and that sort of democratic legitimacy. This is what the public actually wants the City Council to do with its long-term plan. This is what the public wants to see as the kind of outline direction for what the city goes in. So how did they go? Well, my underlying observation was that the basic concept of the Citizens' Assembly was really strongly validated. These 43 ordinary citizens gave up a huge amount of their personal time. They took the task extremely seriously. They listened well, they reflected in an atmosphere of largely mutual respect, and were able to reach consensus. I observed a lot of really good listening, really good turn-taking, very serious engagement with each other. Nothing that I saw that, represented anything, sort of that you wouldn't want to see, anything hostile or disrespectful. There were inevitably a few people who dominated or tried to dominate the discussion, and you can all take your own guess of what demographic they were from. But that tendency, sorry, that's my phone, that tendency was largely kept in check by the facilitators. And that's a really crucial point about all of this. Of course, because group discussion can go very badly, and there's some evidence that unstructured group discussion leads to really unhealthy democratic outcomes. But well-structured, well-facilitated discussion doesn't. And by and large, the facilitators did a good job of encouraging that. And it was also quite noteworthy that when one particular demographic of people sort of got themselves together on one table and sort of decided that they were going to sort things out, the facilitator observed at the next session that the draft recommendations that had been put up from the table with the least diversity had scored the worst in the subsequent rounds of filtering out and downvoting and upvoting the recommendations, which I think was a message that got through. Anyway, it was demonstrated that the public's appetite for engaging with these decision-making processes is real, as long as the opportunity offered seems meaningful. And again, I really want to stress, the commitment from the citizens to doing something good and meaningful was really impressive. They really wanted to make a difference. They felt honoured, and they felt, that they'd be entrusted with something really serious and important, and they wanted to do something that was useful and that would change things. And so it was a really good counter to some of the traditional stereotypes that some people have about citizens, in which I get thrown back at me, often when I'm talking about these things. So often it's argued, people don't want to be this engaged. Well, the response rates tell you that they do. And do people have the ability? Well, I observed that, citizens to a fair extent do have the ability to grapple with these really complex questions. Nonetheless, there were some shortcomings in the process. The long-term plan is a really complex thing to try to get people to engage on. It's very, very informationally dense. You're talking about something like 15 or so major spending areas that the council has. It's ranging across everything, at least notionally, from water to the arts to heritage to open spaces to housing to all sorts of infrastructure. Huge, and each of those things has its own complex set of needs and demands and theories and values and a budget attached to it. So it was a very, very complex question to ask a Citizens' Assembly to consider. That sort of thing can work, but it's probably not ideally where things would have started. But I think that was a reflection of the fact that the council had the budget to do really quite deep engagement on the long-term plan, and indeed has a legal mandate to do so. So it sort of administratively seemed like a good place to start. The council was also not able to provide the Assembly with all the information that it needed. I can't tell you exactly why not, but the Assembly didn't have a kind of a it didn't have the fully detailed financial information that I would have liked to see it have. It was given information about where the council currently spends money. It was given some projections about borrowing and some information about sort of rates rises and rates as a percentage of income, and a sense that the council might be quite close to its limits with both those ways of funding its activities. But the Assembly certainly didn't have, sort of outline budgets for the coming years saying exactly, this is how much the council plans to spend, this is what its revenue is planned to be, this is what its borrowing is planned to be. So the Assembly wasn't in a position that I think ideally it would have been in, and that I think some of its members wanted to be in, where they could have given quite a detailed financial steer to the council. That simply wasn't possible, owing to the lack of that information. The council's responses to the Assembly's requests for information were also variable. So the way the process worked was there were 4 Saturdays, and the first Saturday in particular was quite exploratory. It was sort of just asking the members, what's on your mind, what's top of mind, what do you think about the long-term plan, what do you think about in terms of the material you've already been provided with, the background reading, what do you want to know? And so then the Assembly came up with a huge number of questions, and they were enormously varied because almost everything's in the long-term plan, and those were filtered back to Council, who then responded to the Assembly members in time for the second Saturday, and that kind of iterative process happened throughout. The initial council responses, I know that a lot of effort went into them, but they strongly resembled a kind of Wellington City Council press release in many places that is very quick to assure you that everything is being done for the best of all possible motives, and that it's, will lead to wonderful long-term outcomes, but is not very informationally rich. And a number of the Assembly members certainly expressed a feeling that the information they got from the council at times felt like they were being sort of guided towards certain things rather than just being given the information. Having said that, the responses from the council improved quite markedly throughout the process, so that by the time of the last Assembly they were getting really useful, and I thought really powerful information back from the council. So it was a bit of a learning process there. But all of this did mean that so what exactly the Assembly was supposed to produce wasn't always clear. They could have, like I said, in a slightly different world, they could have sort of given quite detailed sort of budgeting and prioritisation of spending advice to the council, but they didn't have the information for that. They could have focused in on sort of just said, well, okay, these things are within scope, these particular bits of the council's budget are, and these aren't. That didn't really happen in a very precise way. They could have come up with a sort of decision-making matrix for the council. These things should be prioritised. These values are more important than others. That didn't really happen either. However, what the Assembly then went through was a process of what I call sort of creative adaptation. So sort of by the kind of on the second day, it became clear that they weren't going to be able to do sort of the detailed, budgeting sort of advice. And so at that point, the task shifted towards just providing some general thematic recommendations. And that happened through quite a detailed process of the the citizens putting up, ideas, possible recommendations for the long-term plan, and I think there were about 40 in the first cut. And then those went through quite a deep process of democratic refinement. So my recollection is of the first 40 or so, only the ones with 80% support from the whole assembly went forward. So it's really quite a good sort of sifting process. And then those ideas were sort of refined in small group discussions. And then and that sort of took up a lot of the third session. And then on the fourth and last session, and I should say that there were council staffers presenting to the assembly members in the first sort of day and a half as well, so giving them a lot of background on what the council does and where it spends its money. And then a bunch of those experts came back in on the fourth day and really worked deeply with the citizens in their sort of theme groups to help them refine their recommendations and try to turn them into something that the council could really use. And that was a really inspiring bit of the process, because it was bringing the citizens as their expertise in their own lives, their knowledge of what their community needs, into dialogue with the sort of subject matter expertise that the council staff have. And I think it's out of those two voices, if you like, those two forms of expertise coming together, that you often get really fantastic policy making that really shifts the dial on things. So those sessions were really inspiring to observe. Subject matter expertise together with expertise in their own lives. And out of that whole process, like multiple rounds of upvoting and downvoting, came sort of the final 10 recommendations. And to get through to that final sort of stage, all the recommendations were run through a sort of a whole group process where people were asked to rate them, the assembly members were asked to rate them on a scale of 5-point sort of L scale. Did they loathe it, lament it, could they live with it, like it, or love it? And the task was to get everybody who'd been at loathe or lament up to the point where they could at least live with the recommendation. And so that involved further refining and polishing and improving the recommendation. So quite a detailed process. And so that resulted in 10 recommendations. And I'm not going to talk about these in detail because I didn't have them down in their exact wording, and I think that'll come with the council's full publication of the results of the assembly and its analysis and everything. And that's the citizens speaking in their own words. And I'd really urge you to, when that comes out, to go and look at it, because that's the real version of this. So this is just my outline, sort of shorthand note-taking version, which I just present just to make this concrete and give you a sense of, what did this thing produce? And so there were sort of 10 recommendations, like I said. The first couple were about social services, effectively, and focusing on things like, we have got lots of NGOs applying to council for funds where they might have overlaps, encouraging them to work more closely together where that's appropriate as a way to make better use of funds potentially. And also a really strong insistence that funding to the NGOs that the council supports, like Wellington City Mission and others, should be maintained. And I should say that all of this was done in a very much an atmosphere of the council's budgets are quite constrained, a lot of discussion about financial constraints, a lot of discussion about the need to reprioritise expenditure. Then there were a couple of recommendations about open spaces. So one was greater consideration about creating more green space, sort of the pocket park type thing, real green space in the CBD, particularly on council properties, particularly if council has buildings that aren't fit for purpose anymore, giving greater consideration to making a green space in those areas. Also a recommendation about council really trying to energise and activate more community groups to be more deeply involved in forest restoration and native planting and invasive weed control and things like that. Again, a great way to do more if you're a bit financially constrained potentially, although not as a way of privatising services. People were very quick to make that clear. A couple of recommendations on capital spending, which were quite high level because it was an informationally complex part of the issue, which was more taxing bit of the discussion, I would say. But basically an emphasis on sort of spreading out capital spending a bit, spreading out spending on new buildings, restoration of buildings, a bit of an emphasis, they struggle to get the wording right on this, but a bit of an emphasis on perhaps maintaining and restoring existing assets ahead of building new ones, except where it's more cost effective to be building the new ones. A couple on housing, one about sort of criteria for heritage status, which again they were quick to say was not about, you know, bulldozing all the heritage buildings, but was just about in very specific circumstances. And the Gordon Wilson block came up often in this discussion about maybe greater priority on housing and planning for growth and sustainability and things like that. Also an emphasis on medium density housing, no great surprises there. And then a couple ones to finish off. A very strong recommendation that the City Council needs more revenue raising powers, that it can't keep going just on borrowing and rates, that it should lobby government to be given the power to you know, things like development sort of uplift levies or congestion charging or something like that. And then finally a recommendation on the process level that council develop processes that are slower, so less hasty, more deliberate, perhaps more deliberative as well, and more inclusive. So more things like the Citizens' Assembly. As I said, this was a really complex question to ask citizens to engage with. And I think because, I mean, each of those areas of just those recommendations I've outlined, you could probably have spent a whole Citizens' Assembly on. That complexity meant that the recommendations weren't developed in full detail, and probably not all of them was tested against every counter-argument that ideally they would have been tested against. But I think they're still really deserving of respect. As I said, they passed through multiple processes of filtration, up and down voting and refinement. And to me, they're a plausible representation of the interests and concerns of the wider Wellington public. You know, so the things that are emphasised: housing, open space, community involvement, finding a way to deliver capital expenditure more efficiently. These are all plausibly things that a representative group of Wellingtonians would focus on, because I think those are the things that are top of mind. Oh, except for things like water infrastructure, which was ruled out of scope because that's being dealt with through other processes. You know, and so I think these recommendations, even if they're a bit vague in places, have real legitimacy. You know, because of that Wellington in a room factor. You know, they really were produced by people who were Wellington in miniature, and because they came through a process of deliberation, they can, I think, reasonably regarded as being the decisions that all 200,000 Wellingtonians would make if we could, all of us, fit into 257. They also reflected a shift from individual preoccupations to the public good. One thing that really struck me is that in the first session, when people were asked what's top of mind for you, there was a lot of stuff about cycleways, and newsflash, none of it positive. But as it was explained to people that, well, the council's done a big push on this, that's kind of, it is what it is, it's done. Also, a lot of the funding for that comes from central government. It's not the huge expenditure you think it is. People shifted out of being sort of preoccupied with things like that and actually did what these processes are supposed to do, would just think, well, okay, well, what is the public good here? Actually, not just what am I sort of cross about, but actually what does everyone in this room, which is Wellington in miniature, want and need? And so I think there was a really great broadening of horizons and a coming to value the public good. Such problems as there were, I think, stem partly from the choice of the long-term plan as the subject, which wouldn't be a problem with future assemblies if they were on slightly more tractable subjects. And also, this was the first time Wellington City Council had tried to run something like that. So the mistakes, the uncertainties, lessons learned are inevitable, and I would argue even a welcome part of any innovative and learning process. So, full council evaluation, which will, give you the really detailed account of all of this, is still to come. But, my view is that the process delivered an outcome of sufficient value and in itself holds sufficient promise, that the Council should firstly implement the recommendations to the greatest extent possible. And it's worth noting that the final act of the Citizens' Assembly was for them to sort of all gather here on one side of the room, and then the Mayor and a number of councillors turned up to receive the recommendations. And the Mayor and Councillor Matthews, who spoke to the recommendations, were very obviously moved, I think, just as I said, just by seeing such a representative and diverse group of Wellingtonians in one room. And I think they were really struck by the rarity and the power of that. And I think they got some sense also, despite not sort of having been there, of just how seriously everyone had taken the recommendations. And so they said, I think Councillor Matthews said, we will honour and we will treasure these recommendations, which, I have written down. And so we'll be holding the Council to account for. This is one of the big sort of ongoing complex things about citizens' assemblies is what decision-making powers do they have? And philosophically, there's an argument that you could actually devolve decision-making powers to them. In practice, that hasn't generally happened yet, and you do have an issue that, although the conclusions these assemblies come to, I think, are hugely legitimate, at the same time, only 43 Wellingtonians have participated in it. And you do have a bit of it can be hard to convince the other 199,600 other Wellingtonians that they should regard those decisions as legitimate, which is quite hard, particularly if they didn't know anything about the Citizens' Assembly. So there's a bunch of complexities there, but I certainly hope that I think these city councils should take those recommendations very seriously and implement them into their long-term plan, and should commission more such assemblies in the future. Because, my view about all these things is, I think the role of representatives is really important. I don't see that as being done away with, but, I would like to see a much richer ecosystem of democratic practices. I think we rely too much on representatives and not enough on active citizenship. So I'd like to see all these things in the assemblies, participatory budgeting, crowdsourced legislation in the mix, much richer set of democratic practices, and that create much more opportunities for us all to be involved, and that these things are woven through, and that they invigorate the democratic systems we now have, and that we sort of rebalance. We change the balance between representative and participatory democracy, so it's a bit more well balanced. And a final sort of image on that, because sometimes people do say, well, this is all very well, but does everyone have time for this? Is this a realistic vision, or are we in the Oscar Wilde sort of quip about socialism situation where he said the problem with socialism is it takes too many evenings? Does everyday democracy take too many evenings? Look, people really wanted to take part in the Citizens' Assembly, which I think is a good start. But I also sort of increasingly think about this metaphor, which I call Democracy Street. And this is just a random picture from the internet. Don't take it as representative. It's not. Everyone in it is white, for one thing. But it's just, I'm just sort of starting to think of this as a way of visualizing things. And it's sort of to say, well, the future might look something like this. And apologies if you can't read the writing. I would never have claimed that design was one of my main abilities. But the point is to say, if you imagine a sort of just an ordinary suburban street, in the sort of everyday democracy future, you might have a couple of people in it who are taking part in the Citizens' Assembly on that particular day or month. You might have a couple of people who are taking part in a participatory budgeting thing where they're deciding how some community funds are allocated to street lighting or park improvements or something. There are some people who are involved in crowdsourced legislation. They're putting up ideas for bills to go before Parliament. You've got some people who are working with the local health authority on, okay, there's this new health centre, how do we co-design it? So actually everything about it, the whole design of it, how every bit of it works, is actually, works the way the community wants. You've got some people who are doing, who aren't doing nice sort of formal, polite, democratic things. You've got people who are marching for climate action, who are protesting. That's super important. And then you've got someone who's not involved in any of these things because actually we all lead busy lives and this is only right for us at certain points in our lives. It's totally legitimate to not be particularly active. and this is all cyclical. You know, no one has to be involved in this stuff all the time. The point of this image is just to say that there's a way of having this future, this everyday democratic future, which is not only kind of exciting and invigorating, but is also realistic and is still a feasible division of democratic labour. I mean, I think that's an optimistic but a realistic vision of how democracy could work better. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Max. Now, time for questions and participation and deliberation. Start right here.
Great, thanks very much. How would you compare the Citizens' Assembly against, say, looking at the council as it is now? Now, all the residents voted for a council, and so they would fully expect, understandably, that those councillors would actually represent their views. So here, how would you compare that to the Citizens' Assembly? And how would you also compare this style of democracy against what the Swiss use? And the Swiss use, I'm sure you know, they use referendums a lot. And so they continually ask the residents, you know, what they would actually like.
Yeah, really good questions. I mean, like I said, I mean, I'm not against representative democracy at all. I think it's important. But I think, I mean, representatives are representative of the wider city, certainly in a political sense, but I mean, they don't but of course the people they've been elected by aren't themselves representative of the city because we have such, you know, weak turnout for local elections. So, you know, there will be a lot of voices who effectively haven't been represented around the council table. Although, of course, I appreciate the councillors will go out and make efforts to engage with those communities anyway. I mean, I think, yeah, so I also think that you can have representatives making decisions, but if, to the extent that it's practical for people to make decisions themselves, that would often be superior because, you know, if we believe in autonomy and we believe in, you know, our desire to sort of have public freedom, you know, because we're very affected as individuals by public decisions. And we can't really be free, I think, unless we have our share in that decision-making power. Then for me, the ultimate is that where possible, people can come together and make decisions themselves. Although realistically, you know, even in this world, people don't have time to take all the political decisions themselves. So there'll always be a huge role for representative democracy. And I think the other way it would compare probably is in the deliberation, the discussion. You can, in politics, conventional politics, have high quality discussion, but I think it would be a fair observation that doesn't always happen. And I think, I mean, I'm less well versed in local government, to be totally honest, but I spent a bit of time watching Parliament, and the quality of the discussion there is appalling / non-existent. Because it's so partisan, you know, because it is, and local government is less partisan, therefore it's probably better on that score. But you just, you know, you see the debate on a bill in the House. I mean, there's no actual meaningful exchange, really. Some good stuff happens at select committee, you know, people listen, reflect a bit, things get changed. But in the House, it's all performative because it's all drilled along partisan lines. So that's just a total failure, or a virtual total failure, from a point of view of actually discussing things and coming to a consensus. And so something like a Citizens' Assembly, one of its great advantages, is it's vastly superior on that front.
Thanks, Max. I put my hand up for being on that Citizens' Assembly as well, so I'm really pleased that you got to go along and hear what they were saying. You said that there was 43 mini Wellington people, or mini Wellington.
A mini Wellington, not many people.
Yeah. But perhaps I'd like a comment. You know, there might be 43 plus all the experts that were part of it, and maybe the 2 facilitators as well, because you see this in the consultations all the time, that if you start from this point of view, you're going to end up at some place over here. But what did you think about? Was it a broad enough starting point? Did you think? I don't know if you saw that, but did you think that they gave a fair representation of all the options available for what to do with their money?
Yeah, I think broadly so. I mean, I think the council staff who turned up and spoke, were trying very hard to keep things open. I mean, if anything, in a way, almost things were too open. The problems were, in this case, I mean, I told you, you're absolutely right. I mean, you could absolutely set up a citizens' assembly and guide it in a way to reach a particular conclusion. And I think that's always one of people's concerns about these things. But I mean, no, this one, I mean, if anything, the tenor of my remarks has been that it was almost too open. It was so broad, and the council were trying very hard not to close off options. That was almost what was sort of difficult to manage about it. I mean, the only thing that I thought I would have liked up front a greater discussion from the council about the alternative revenue sources, because I slightly thought that by sort of the council staff effectively standing up and saying, well, we're pretty close to our legal borrowing limit and we are close to what we feel are reasonable rates levels, like as a percentage of people's income. I'm just going to be straining people too much if we go over that. That's all fair enough, but by sort of saying that and then just almost sort of stopping the conversation, I felt it biased things a little bit in a conservative direction, in the sense of, gosh, well, there's just no money, so what are we going to do? But then what's interesting is that, I mean, one of the ways that citizens' assemblies maintain their agenda-setting power and resist being corralled by the body that sets them up is they have the power to call their own experts. Now, this wasn't fully used in this one just because there was so much content that it was hard, but classically, in a citizens' assembly, before the first session or during the first session, there might be a thing we say, well, okay, well, who do you want to hear from next? And then we'll line those people up for the... And there was a little bit of that in this case. And then actually, as you can see in one of the recommendations, was the Assembly saying, well, the council really needs to lobby for more revenue-raising powers. So they actually maintained their agenda-setting independence in a way and pushed back against one of the things that I was concerned about. So, so I felt like the council did a good job in that sense, by and large. Some of their responses to the first sets of questions, like I said, the Assembly members did feel a little bit directed. But no, by and large, I thought the agenda was kept really open. I was impressed by that.
Thanks. My name is Felicity. Just reflecting on the representativeness of the group, just a couple of comments, and I'm interested in your views. Wellington has some very specific demographics. For example, it's only got 12.6% Māori across Wellington, but you mentioned 16% in the group. And if you look at how long people are here, for example, just in the Wellington Central electorate, which of course is only one of 3 of them, 30% of people are here for less than 1 year when they vote. So there's this great sort of throughput of mobility in Wellington. And I wondered, if you think about democracy, there's something about people of the place or people who are invested long-term in that place versus people who are coming and going. Can you comment on that?
I mean, on the first point, I think there was totally legitimate desire to slightly oversample for ethnic minority populations, partly because other citizens' assemblies are showing that, because of the stresses on those populations, they aren't always able to stay right throughout the assembly, and there was a little bit of drop-off of that, and also just because those are voices that are massively underrepresented normally. There's no harm in a little bit of over-representation. So I think that was part of the thinking there. On the transience point, all right, that's an interesting one. I haven't really thought too hard about that, so this is just sort of top-of-the-head stuff. I mean, you can have a sort of philosophical view. I'm very community-minded, and I love people who've stayed around for a long time, and I think there's a lot of richness in that. I love institutional memory. But, if you're legally entitled to vote, then, your vote isn't counted as worth less than anyone else's. And I think a citizens' assembly is just would perhaps naturally have the same proportion of short-term and long-term people. Not sure it'd be sort of democratically legitimate if it didn't. And the thing is, you couldn't, I don't think you can have a sliding scale where you'd sort of be back in John Stuart Mill, wouldn't you? Sort of, educated people get 2 votes and very educated people get 4 votes. If you were going to give some sort of preference to long-standing, and also people who are here for relatively short periods of time still have a really important input to give. I think, students, for instance, are only here for 2 to 3 years sometimes. They're a really important part of the city. The city needs to work for them. And so I think it's, appropriate that they're in there as well. Yeah, I think it has to be a balance in that way.
Max, one of the people watching online has asked about remuneration options.
Yes, that's a very good point, and I should have covered that. So all the participants were given a $800 donation / koha in recognition, not really sort of payment, but in recognition of their effort. And they were also all offered compensation for any travel and childcare and sort of related costs that they incurred. I don't know how many took that up. That will probably be in the council report. But that was all made available, and that's really important because you want people to be able to participate, and particularly people from low-income backgrounds will struggle. Otherwise, people don't want to be paid, though, necessarily. This is a volunteering. People do it because they want, as a sort of part of their citizenship. And so sometimes you survey people who've been in citizen assemblies and they say, no, we don't want to be remunerated, because then that's making it a transaction, like we're only doing it to be paid. But I think it's very important that the offer is there for people for whom it's important.
Max, I'm part of the group in Porirua working with Ngāti Toa on a treaty-based assembly, which is very exciting work. It's all voluntary and it's all community-led as opposed to government or local government-led. A couple of thoughts about it. Firstly, the time involved when you move into a treaty relationship is much greater, and it's a much more complex process, but we're excited. We think we've got a model which is going to work. Do you have a view about the place of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in decision-making here in Aotearoa? We believe that is a distinctive part of our being as a nation, and therefore needs to be part of deliberative democracy as it is with others. But what do you think?
Look, it's an incredibly important question. I don't know that I have a particularly good answer to it yet. I really admire the work you're doing. I've heard a bit about it from Kelly O'Neill when she presented a couple of weeks ago. Broadly speaking, I think it's the right way to go, because I do believe in the Mātika Mai model, where that the Te Tiriti embeds separate and equal spheres of government and governance, and that ultimately, Māori may well demand and want and need a separate set of decision-making bodies with their own powers, and that could be the Māori Parliament that Te Pāti Māori is talking about. It could be something else. I think ultimately that's, in the long run, that's where we'll get to as a country, I think, albeit, a little bit of reversal of direction just at the moment. At the central government level, and that's the to and fro's of social progress. So I think that's absolutely the right model at the highest level. There's obviously a complexity in reflecting that in sort of the pure citizens' assembly in the Western sense, which is demographically representative. It's not. Yeah, well, which in your build, because you're building it into the design, right, in a really specific way. Yeah. I think there's a bunch of things you can do. To be honest, and this is a bit of a vague answer, but it's just where I'm at. I think all the stuff is going to evolve, and we're going to work it out as we go along. I definitely don't have a nice, neat solution for any of that. I think people are going to try a bunch of things. I think what you're doing with Ngāti Toa is the most exciting stuff that's happening in the space at the moment, and so I'm watching really eagerly to see what comes from it. And frankly, when you're through that process, you'll be able to answer that question much better than I'll be able to. And I really look forward to that.
Marion next.
Thank you. You've restored a lot of hope, actually, in a fairly dismal period of time. I'm thinking about it, though, not only in local government and in central government, but in organisations. So I chair Heritage New Zealand. There are a number of decisions in there that I'd love to take out to something the equivalent of that. Is that feasible? In other words, you've given examples local, but can we take it out to NGOs or ACEs?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. I mean, like I said, and this maybe comes back to the question earlier about representative democracy, you know, these things aren't perfect for everything, but, you know, where there's really complex moral trade-offs and, you know, you really want to know, well, what does the public think or a group of people think when they sit down and either toss with each other as ordinary people, or you're deadlocked, you know, or something's become really heated and you just need to sort of lower the temperature a bit. These kinds of things are perfect. I mean, and I think this is possibly a view that will satisfy no one in this room, but I think the housing density, medium density versus heritage debate has been not super constructive. I mean, I'm very pro medium density housing, but I'm not convinced it always needs to come at the expense of heritage. And I just don't think, whatever one's views about the two sides of that argument and the people on them, I would struggle to think of a lot of forums I've seen at any point in the last few years where those two sides have come together in a constructive way. I mean, there's been plenty of shouting and stuff, but, you know, have those groups, or has people ever been in a room where they're encouraged to sort of get out of their kind of defensive crouch and listen and engage respectfully? I mean, I understand particularly why the pro-housing density people don't want to do that, because they feel, understandably, like they've been shut out of a lot of decision-making for a long period of time, and I absolutely get the levels of frustration. But, yeah, I think we could have had, and we could still have some much more constructive discussions around that, because it's a classic trade-off, right? You know, I mean, those are both things that have strong underpinnings. I mean, fundamentally, housing people is the most important thing, but heritage has a really important value as well. And, yeah, I mean, you want to see what emerges out of those trade-offs, and you'll only discover that if you build that kind of forum. So, yeah, I think absolutely, yeah.
Arthur.
Yes. My thoughts are around if citizens' assemblies are to be successful, those that participate in it need to feel at the end of it that they've come up with recommendations that they're happy with. They think they've reached something that they otherwise would not have reached, and they are quality decisions. Those that are not part of it want to see the decisions that come out of it and say, well, it's pretty good what's come out of it. So my question is, do you believe, or did you feel that those 43 that took part in this Citizens' Assembly at the end of it felt satisfied that they'd reach a quality of decision making that they can go with and feel pleased with?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I haven't gone and interviewed participants yet. With the City Council's permission, I'd like to. I think you could see their sense of it evolving as the process went through. There were definitely, you know, periods where I think they felt really daunted by the scale of it and by the informational complexity / overload. But I think that, I mean, I got the sense that they were proud of where they'd got to. I think they were aware of the limitations of what they'd done, and that each of the recommendations, I think they probably had a sense of where they'd got to on day 4 often was maybe where they would have liked to have got to on day 3, and that there was more work to be done. That's my sense. I mean, I can't speak for them. But yeah, I think they felt like they'd done good work. A number of them commented unprompted on the fact that it just made them realise that they really live in a bubble. normally, and just being exposed to different views had been really powerful. And so I think they had a sense that, they'd contributed, there'd been contributions you wouldn't normally hear in a democratic process. But I think, look, honestly, it's a really important question. It's one I will be asking, but I think, and it'll depend a bit probably how they feel about it in terms of how the City Council actually picks up the recommendations. That'll be quite crucial. And the other thing that matters, you talked about how the public sees those recommendations. I talked about it a bit earlier. There is this issue that if the wider public doesn't know this thing happened, it's much less likely they're going to see its decisions as legitimate. And then a council saying, well, the Citizens' Assembly said we should do this, doesn't carry much weight at that point. So what I would hope the City Council is encouraging the participants to do is to sort of go out there and be, promoters of the Citizens' Assembly themselves, talk about it, get in the media, spread the word, talk about what they did, not to do the propaganda thing, not to say it was perfect, but say, here's this thing we did, it had these values in it, and kind of spread the word. But then, of course, and I think the more, ideally, as long as the City Council does more of these things, the more you do them also, the more people get to know that they happen and the more legitimate they come to be seen. Jury's still out on that, I think, but it's a really good question.
Question here.
Thank you, Max. In my view, one of the downfalls of consultation, well, two of them, one is that it's a tick box exercise for whoever runs it. They've made their decision anyway, but we've consulted. But the other is that there's mostly no feedback loop as to what happened to what we said, what we suggested, how could you achieve that in this Citizens' Assembly forum?
Yeah, that's a really good question more generally. And I should say, I'm not fully against consultation. Like I said, when you've got a rich ecosystem of different things you can do, there's times when a straightforward consultation will be fine. Yeah, as long as it's not, just a propaganda exercise and the real decision's already been taken. But that's not, that's sort of more, that's not a problem you can fix with structures and things. And it frustrates me that on the rare occasions when I do take part in a consultation, there's no feedback loop. No one, I don't expect to get my way when I put my views in. As I often say to people, democracy is disappointment, because other people have different views and you aren't going to always get your way. But at the very least, the bare minimum sort of procedural thing for legitimacy is you should be told why you didn't get your way, right? It's that basic. And I'm sort of astounded and horrified that it just doesn't often happen. It's true of central government consultations as well. One thing I would love to see City Council do, if there's any staff here listening, would be a little thing about thinking about what extent they are closing the loop and how they could do that better. In these things, it's really interesting. So one thing I forgot to mention is that the Citizens' Assembly were understandably very keen to see that their recommendations got listened to or ideally taken up. And so they kind of sort of self-organised a group, mini group within the mini public of sort of guardians or kaitiaki to basically sort of keep tabs for a little while on what the City Council is doing with the recommendations. So that is sort of happening already informally, and you can also build those kinds of structures in. So with participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, for instance, where they're handing out, the community is determining quite large chunks of public works budgets for street improvements and new health centres and new community centres and all the rest of it. Often there will be committees that run for the whole of the next year from the community that are just there to check up on the implementation, because of course, as I imagine it's one thing passing a policy, awful lot of things go wrong in implementation classically. So absolutely, you have to build those structures in as well.
Very last question.
Thank you. Let's go back to what you were saying about Parliament and how it doesn't work because it's also very performative. People perform when they've got an audience. Parliament, but people are watching. You know, we can see what goes on in Parliament. We can watch it live on TV. It's all recorded in Hansard, so forth. There's no audience at all for this. It was completely untransparent. I knew it was happening because there's a message saying we're going to write to 10,000 of you. I wasn't one of them. We heard nothing at all about what these people were doing. We have the word of the council that they were genuinely representative. We have your word that it was the meetings were all well moderated, but I didn't see any of that. And as such, I think the element that's missing here is transparency. So the question is, would this be better if it were more transparent, if meetings were open to the public? Alternatively, if you think not, would Parliament be better if it wasn't so open? And if there was more opportunity for parliamentarians to get together when they know the public's not watching and the press isn't watching, and therefore they can actually talk to each other civilly instead of having to put on the Punch and Judy show that is what the media seem to want to report on.
Yeah, look, again, I mean, a really great question and not an easy one to answer. What I think, I mean, and there's people in the audience probably know more about this than I do, but my understanding is that it's pretty common practice that a citizens' assembly, the deliberations are confidential because of that issue, that people, if the cameras are on, they will feel less able to discuss things freely and it'll be more performative and all those sorts of problems. The way that I think that, as I understand it, citizens' assemblies normally try to square the sort of the balance with transparency is they make quite a lot of things publicly available. So all the evidence that's presented to a citizens' assembly should be publicly available, and the expert presentations should be filmed and should be made publicly available. And I would say ideally in real time or something like that. And then obviously you need full reporting of what went on. I mean, you know, anonymised, not with sort of individuals' names and Chatham House rules sort of stuff. But you need a full account of it afterwards as well. So I'm not actually quite sure exactly what the council's planning to do in terms of what it publishes, but that's certainly the standard it should meet. It is going to, and I understand that it's imminent, publish its full evaluation, and there's a whole lot of video footage that they took, and that takes a long time to be edited, and I think that's what's slowing things down. So a lot of that stuff will come out. But yeah, it's a balance. I mean, I'm a big believer in transparency, but at the same time, you know, I don't think you do have to preserve spaces, even right at the heart of central government, for instance, for discussions that are relatively confidential. I think someone just said that's what Cabinet does, well, and it's absolutely true. You know, you publish Cabinet papers, well, New Zealand does. I mean, that's quite a remarkable thing. Most democracies don't. It's very good that we publish Cabinet papers, but we don't get a blow-by-blow account of everything that happened in Cabinet, and I think that's appropriate as well. So it's about having the balance right. You may well be correct, but that this one hasn't been as well publicised as it should have been, that people wouldn't feel confident in the level of transparency around it. And if that's so, then that's something that City Council needs to think really hard about, because, yeah, people have to have confidence in this, and these things need to be as transparent as is reasonably possible.
We've run out of time. You've really taken us into the heart of the whole Citizens' Assembly, Max, so thank you for that. Would you all join me in thanking Max for a tremendous session?